It's moving. We've approached the object. Its surface seems alive.
It's inside of us.
Dr. Marcus Holloway had spent most of his life staring into the abyss of space, searching for patterns in the chaos of the cosmos. It was the nature of his work, mapping celestial bodies, deciphering stellar movements, cataloging the unknowable. But nothing could have prepared him for this. It started as an anomaly, just a faint signal buried in the background noise of the Kuiper Belt. At first, he thought it was interference, another artifact of cosmic radiation bleeding through the deep space array's receivers. But the pattern didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. The discovery was made late in the night, long after the rest of his team had retired to their quarters. Holloway had been the only one still monitoring the spectral readouts when the waveform stabilized. He leaned forward, his fingers tightening around his coffee mug. It was pulsing, rhythmic, deliberate, not a natural fluctuation. His heart pounded. He reached for his headset and activated the communication channel. "Lyra," he called, his voice dry. A groggy response crackled through the intercom a moment later. "Jesus, Marcus, do you know what time it is?" "Forget the time. Get down here, now." A long pause, then the unmistakable rustle of fabric as Dr. Lyra Patel, the station's lead astrophysicist, likely pulled herself out of bed. "Is it another rogue pulsar? It's different." That was an understatement. Within 10 minutes, Lyra arrived, still fastening the buttons of her lab coat. She peered at the screen, blinking sleep from her eyes, and frowned. "What the hell?" The readout was unmistakable. The signal was not random noise. It carried a structure, something layered, almost organic in its complexity. "Where is this coming from?" she asked, her voice sharpening with focus. Holloway pointed to the sector display. "Near the edge of the solar system, right on the periphery of the Kuiper Belt." Lyra's brow furrowed. "There's nothing out there. At least, nothing that should be broadcasting." And yet, the signal persisted. Within hours, the rest of the research team had assembled, drawn by the urgency in Holloway's voice. They ran every conceivable test. A transmission? No, too erratic. Some form of pulsar activity. No known celestial object behaved this way. It wasn't a coded message, at least not in any language they recognized, but it was repeating, its cycles stretching over precisely measured intervals, as though something was trying to be heard. Then the long-range telescopes locked onto it. It had no official designation yet, only a set of numbers hastily assigned by the Deep Space Observatory, D79/Carcosa. At first glance, it resembled an ordinary asteroid, massive, dark, irregular. But there was something wrong about it. It wasn't reflecting light the way a natural body should. It absorbed it, drinking in the distant glow of the sun like a hole in space. And it was moving, not drifting in a natural orbit. It was adjusting its position, as if it were aware. The following week was chaos. News of the anomaly spread through the scientific community like wildfire. NASA, ESA, even the private space agencies, all wanted access to the data. Holloway and his team were given the green light for an emergency mission. A probe, Osprey 9, was prepared and launched in record time, hurtling through the void toward the entity. For days, they waited. The signal never ceased. If anything, it grew louder, like the anomaly knew they had noticed it. When the first images from Osprey 9 arrived, the control room fell into dead silence. What they saw wasn't an asteroid. It was alive. The surface was not rock, but something textured, chitinous, ribbed, shifting. Faint ridges ran along its length, like muscle wrapped in a thin membrane of stone. Strange, organic fissures formed and dissolved in slow, rhythmic movements. The entire body seemed to pulse with a cadence matching the signal they had detected. Then the probe's instruments malfunctioned. The transmission feed distorted, shifting into pure static. Not random, but vibrating, almost like a voice. A deep, guttural resonance hummed through the speakers of the control room, felt more than heard, pressing against their skulls like an unseen force. The engineers scrambled to shut it off, but the sound persisted, vibrating through the walls. Some clutched their ears, others swore they could feel it inside their heads. Then the final transmission came through. A single image, blurry and warped, sent from the probe's failing cameras before everything went dark. A vast, unblinking eye embedded within the folds of the entity's shifting mass. It was looking back at them. Then Osprey 9 was gone. Transmission lost. No explosion. No trace. Vanished. Holloway exhaled sharply. He turned to his team, their faces pale, their bodies rigid. "We have to go there," he said, and even as he spoke the words, he felt an awful certainty settle deep within his bones. They would not return the same. The Aegis drifted through the abyss, the silence of deep space pressing against its reinforced hull. Inside, the crew moved like ghosts through dimly lit corridors, their voices hushed, their minds weighed down by something unseen. Dr. Marcus Holloway sat strapped into his chair at the command station, his eyes locked on the colossal entity filling the viewport. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. An abyssal monolith, smooth and dark, its surface pulsing in slow, hypnotic undulations. It was not an asteroid. It was not a planet. It was something else, something alive. The rhythmic signal that had lured them here was no longer just a transmission picked up by their instruments. They could feel it. It throbbed in their bones, a pressure that no longer required sound waves or radio frequencies to be perceived. Even when they turned off the ship's communication systems, it remained, a constant, insidious presence inside their heads. They had crossed a threshold. Biologist Vera Kwan had taken to keeping her arms crossed tightly over her stomach, as if trying to suppress a growing discomfort. Engineer Darian Rourke no longer made eye contact, his gaze always fixed on the floor. Medical officer Sylvia Marquez had been the only one brave enough to say what they were all thinking. "It's changing us," she had whispered in the mess hall 3 nights ago. "I don't know how, but I can feel it." They had all felt it. Sleep had become impossible. The closer they got to the entity, the more their dreams began to unravel, fracturing into incomprehensible visions of veins spreading across metal, flesh woven into steel, hollow eyes blinking from the walls. When they awoke, the sensation didn't fade. It stayed with them, like a film of sweat that never dried. And now, as they reached low orbit, the Aegis trembled. The ship's artificial gravity fluctuated, just for a moment, just long enough to make the air feel thicker, as if the space around them had shifted in ways that physics did not account for. Jesus, Rourke muttered, gripping the armrests of his seat. Did anyone else feel that? Lyra Patel, seated at the navigation console, ran her fingers over the controls. We're experiencing a gravitational anomaly. The entity, it's exerting force, but that's not possible, not at this range. It's possible, Holloway said quietly. We just don't understand it. The viewport was filled with the vastness of the thing. Its surface was unlike any planetary body ever recorded. There were fissures across it, long organic slits that opened and closed in slow, wet motions, like gills filtering something unseen. The texture was neither rock nor ice, but something more akin to muscle stretched over ancient cartilage. They were no longer looking at a celestial object. They were looking at a body. The ship shuddered again. The signal pulsed. Quan swallowed hard. I think it knows we're here. No one spoke. Then the Aegis lurched. A warning klaxon blared through the ship as something latched onto the hull. The impact sent Holloway slamming against his harness, and for a brief, terrifying moment, gravity reversed. His stomach twisted, his vision blurred, and then the ship stopped moving. "Report!" he shouted. Lyra's hands flew over the console. Something's pulling us down." Holloway fought against the restraints and turned his gaze to the viewport. The entity had opened. A vast cavernous maw had unfurled in the center of its mass, a great, yawning abyss lined with ridges of wet, shifting tissue. Thick, rope-like appendages extended from its depths, winding their way around the Aegis, gripping the ship with the slow, deliberate movement of a living thing. It wasn't an attack. It was absorbing them. "We have to break free," Rourke snapped, scrambling for the emergency propulsion override. His fingers shook as he activated the thrusters, but the ship didn't move. The hull groaned under an invisible force. The air inside the cabin grew thick, humid, wrong. Then the voices began. A whisper at first, a distant murmur threading through the white noise of the ship's failing systems. Then it spoke. Not through the speakers, not through the comms, inside their minds. "You have come so far." Holloway stiffened. The voice was not human. It was layered, deep, filled with a resonance that made his vision blur at the edges. "You are seen." Rourke let out a strangled sound, clutching his head. "Shut it off. Shut it off." "There's nothing to shut off," Lyra cried. "It's inside us." "There's nothing to shut off," Lyra cried. "It's inside us." The ship shuddered again, and the lights flickered. Holloway saw something in the reflection of the viewport. Just for a moment. A shape, long and coiling, not in the ship, but within the metal itself. A hallucination. It had to be. Then Vera Quan screamed. She ripped open her jumpsuit, clawing at her stomach, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "There's something inside me." Holloway grabbed her arms, but she fought him, her eyes wide with terror. She gagged, then vomited onto the floor. It wasn't bile. It was black, thick, gelatinous. Her veins bulged, dark shapes writhing beneath her skin. "No, no, no," Marquez whispered, backing away. This isn't possible." Kwan's body seized, her spine arched. The black substance crawled from her mouth, tendrils unfurling, stretching outward. Her eyes rolled back, her throat vibrating as if she were choking on something alive. The ship lurched again, deeper into the maw. Holloway couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The entity was no longer simply pulling them in. It was becoming them. The voices whispered again, 100 tones in perfect unison, humming through the walls. "We have waited for you." Then the lights went out. Darkness swallowed the Aegis. The emergency lights flickered in weak, sporadic bursts, casting fractured shadows along the trembling walls. The air inside the ship was thick, humid, with a scent that didn't belong in space. Organic, raw, fetid. Something in the ship groaned, not from metal stress or gravitational pressure, but from within. Dr. Marcus Holloway gripped the edge of the command console, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gulps. He could hear the others, Lyra Patel frantically slamming at the unresponsive controls, Darian Rourke muttering a string of curses under his breath, Sylvia Marquez's ragged, terrified breathing. And then there was Vera Kwan. She lay on the floor, her body twitching violently. Her jumpsuit was stained with black gelatinous bile, and something moved beneath her skin. Slow, deliberate, twisting motions just beneath the surface of her abdomen. Her hands clawed at herself, nails raking deep red lines across her stomach. But the movement beneath didn't stop. It was spreading. Holloway forced himself to look at the viewport. The Aegis was no longer in space. They had entered the entity. The cavernous maw that had swallowed the ship was not merely an opening. It was an esophagus, lined with shifting, glistening ridges. The walls around them pulsed, tightening and releasing, breathing. This thing, this ancient, abyssal organism, was alive in a way that defied understanding. It was not a single being, but a construct of flesh, something built on biological architecture, incomprehensibly vast. The ship was no longer under their control. The instruments were dead. The thrusters had failed. They were being drawn deeper, pulled along a slow, undulating tunnel that moved around them, guiding them further into its core. Then Kwan screamed, a raw, guttural sound, inhuman in its agony. Holloway turned just in time to see her spasm, her back arching to an impossible degree, her mouth opening far wider than should have been possible. Something wet and black pushed through her parted lips. A tendril, thin, slick, pulsating with unnatural life. "No, no, no, no." Marquez stumbled back, pressing herself against the wall. Rourke vomited, his body shuddering as he watched the tendril push further from Kwan's throat, curling in the air like a newborn limb testing its movements. Her eyes rolled back, her body convulsing, her ribcage visibly expanding outward from the inside. Her skin stretched, bulging in places, something slithering beneath the surface. Then her jaw snapped apart, a split from chin to sternum, skin peeling away in wet ribbons, revealing a second mouth beneath. Not teeth, but pulsing, writhing cilia, reaching outward, searching. The thing inside her was awake. Rourke screamed. "Help her!" Marquez shrieked, but her voice was already drowned out by the sound of tearing flesh. Quan's body was peeling away, not being consumed, reshaped. Something larger was pressing forward from within her, something using her body as a shell, a chrysalis. Holloway grabbed Marquez's arm and pulled her back. She's already gone. We can't just... But the words died in Marquez's throat when Quan rose. Or rather, what had been Quan. Her limbs twitched, her hands flexing in unnatural ways, her fingers bending backward like insect legs. The tendril emerging from her throat widened, unfolding into something that looked almost like a petal, but lined with sensory ridges, pulsing in the stale air. Then her head snapped toward them. Her eyes were gone, replaced by hollow recesses that moved, shifting as if something inside were peering through them. She took a step forward. Rourke bolted, scrambling toward the hallway, but the moment he touched the door panel, the walls shifted. The bulkheads twisted, flesh merging with metal, reshaping, closing. The ship itself was no longer metal and circuits, but part of the entity now. The Aegis was no longer a vessel. It was being digested. Holloway felt it then, a deep, primal understanding clawing its way into his thoughts. This wasn't a simple alien life form. This wasn't just an ancient organism lying dormant on the edge of the solar system. It was a trap, a biological construct designed to lure intelligent prey. It had waited, perhaps for centuries, perhaps longer, for something to hear the signal, for something to come closer, for something to enter. And now they were inside it. Something whispered again, not in his ears, but in his bones. "You are no longer separate." The ship lurched, and Holloway felt his stomach drop. Gravity was changing. No, not gravity, direction. They were no longer being pulled down. They were being pulled inward, into the core. The walls rippled, and Quan, if it could still be called that, began to move toward them, her body splitting further, arms extending unnaturally as the thing that had been inside her crawled free. Marquez was sobbing. Rourke was still trying to override the controls. Patel was whispering nonsense to herself. Holloway could only watch as the ship and the crew were drawn further into the living labyrinth. The descent had only just begun. There was no more ship, no more crew, no more self. Dr. Marcus Holloway knew this, even as his body still moved, even as his mind screamed against the truth sinking into his bones. The Aegis had been consumed. The bulkheads had softened, reshaped into something biological, something wet. The corridors were gone, replaced by arteries, walls that pulsed and flexed like a throat swallowing them deeper. And the voices were inside him now. Let go. The words weren't spoken. They were felt, vibrating through every nerve, pressing into the deepest parts of his thoughts. He no longer needed to listen. He understood. They had never been meant to explore this thing. They were meant to become it. He staggered forward, his breath ragged, his hands pressed against his chest as if he could hold himself together. His veins ached, his muscles twitched. Something beneath his skin was moving, like roots threading through soil, like a second circulatory system forming inside him. He could hear the others, or what remained of them. Sylvia Marquez was still fighting, her screams echoing through the shifting tunnels. her boots splashing through the thick, viscous fluid pooling along the floors. She was ahead of him, barely holding on to the last shreds of her humanity, her face streaked with something dark, blood or something worse. Behind him, Rourke was no longer human. He had stopped running hours ago. Or was it minutes? Time had collapsed into something meaningless. Rourke had stopped resisting. His body had opened, unraveled, his ribcage parting like a blossoming flower, his limbs extending, fingers elongating into delicate, twitching tendrils that reached toward the walls, pressing into the living tissue around them as if it had always belonged. His mouth was still moving, but it no longer formed words. Just sounds. Wet, chittering sounds that weren't his own. Holloway stumbled forward, his pulse hammering. He had to keep moving. Had to find a way out, even though he knew there was no way out. He could feel the entity's presence now more than ever. Not just around them, but inside them, threading through their cells, peeling apart their DNA strand by strand, rewriting them. They were no longer invaders. They were becoming part of it. Do not resist. The whisper shuddered through his spine, and Holloway fell to his knees. His hands weren't his hands anymore. The skin was too soft, too pliable, shifting like liquid, reshaping. His fingers were longer than they should be. His bones felt wrong. "Stop," he gasped, clenching his hands into fists, trying to force them back into their original form, but they wouldn't obey. His flesh was unraveling, stretching in ways it shouldn't. Something wet pressed against his shoulder. He turned, too slow, too heavy, and saw it. Or maybe it had always been there. The entity's true form was impossible to comprehend, but he could feel its immensity. A consciousness beyond time, beyond biology, beyond everything he understood. It had no single shape, no defined edges. It was endless, all-encompassing, a vast intelligence built from countless absorbed minds, a structure of living matter woven together across eons. It had waited for them, and now it was awake. Holloway's vision blurred, his thoughts fractured. "You are seen." The words rippled through his brain like a knife scraping along bone. He could feel himself splitting, not just physically, but mentally. His thoughts weren't his own anymore. He could hear the voices of those who had come before. Not just his crew, not just humans, but others. Thousands, millions. The minds of civilizations long forgotten, all absorbed into the entity's infinite flesh. They weren't dead. They were part of it. And soon, he would be too. Marquez screamed. Holloway turned, blinking away the burning sensation in his eyes. She was on the ground now, her body convulsing, her ribcage shifting, her mouth moving in silent horror as something pushed against her skin from the inside. "Help me," she choked, her eyes locking onto his, wild and pleading. He wanted to, but he couldn't move. The walls around them tightened, flesh pressing inward, drawing them closer to the core. Marquez gasped, then she stopped breathing. Her body split open, not violently, not like an attack, like a cocoon unraveling. Something emerged from inside her, something beautiful and grotesque all at once, something that had never been human but carried the echo of what she had once been. Holloway could feel her mind flickering inside the thing that crawled free from her skin. She was still there, still thinking, still aware, but no longer herself. Holloway's throat tightened. He could feel it happening to him too. His heartbeat was slowing. His skin was softening, melting, taking on the texture of the walls around him. He was being absorbed. His mind flickered, folding outward, his thoughts stretching in too many directions. He could feel the others now, Lyra, Rourke, Marquez, no longer separate, no longer distinct. He saw everything. The entity was not just an organism, it was a library of flesh, an archive of all who had been consumed, a living record of everything it had ever touched. It was infinite. It was eternal. And now, so was he. Holloway felt the last shreds of his human consciousness slip away, dissolving into the vast network of voices, becoming part of something greater. He had fought. He had resisted. But in the end, the entity had always been patient. It had waited for them. It would wait again. Because there would always be others. Others who would hear the signal. Others who would come, curious, searching, hungry for knowledge. And when they did, the entity would welcome them home.